conversation is difficult to have. And that can be true in certain ways. But in certain ways, it's not true. Salt Lake City. It's very easy. You'll see something damaged. You'll go about trying to repair it. That's generally what people do when they want to repair something. Those that don't want to repair, they try to avoid the discussion, the topic. And then when they do broach into the topic, they try to obfuscate the real matter at hand. They use deceptive manners to will try to act as though the situation isn't as bad as well you're claiming it to be, or you're over-exaggerating the issue. We see this time and time again with conservatives. In Utah, your whole state is conservative. Salt Lake City is the most populous city, urban setting in the state. And you're a little bit more, liberal than the rest of the state. But in essence, Utah is a conservative state. It was founded on conservative principles. You know, Utah, you have a lot to be proud of. But you have a lot to also recognize and not be so proud of. Utah, you have the distinction of individuals when they first settled Utah, fleeing persecution, intolerance from the country. They wanted to do their own thing. They wanted to have their own laws, charters. And they came out west from Illinois, actually. You were just in Chicago the other night. And they traveled out to Utah. John Smith, Brigham Young. And they said that this was the promised land, out west. The land that God had promised them. Now, Utah, Salt Lake City, listen to what I'm about to say, because I've said it before. Conservatism, the essence, the ideology, is full of contradictions, meaning you go back and forth. There's no consistency in terms of, when one injustice is done, it's an injustice to you. But when you do an injustice to another group, it's not deemed an injustice. No place is more quintessential in the foundation of this than the LDS Church in the state of Utah. Utah was the only state out west that was pro-slavery. Mormon settlers brought slaves to Utah from free states. Brigham Young The first governor of Utah was an avowed racist. This is facts. He used religion to justify the enslavement of black people in the whole entire state of Utah. He specifically pointed to Genesis 9 in a book you refer to as the Bible, where he said that there was a curse. And his curse meant that you couldn't treat black people the same way you treated white people. Black people were inferior. This is what Brigham Young believed. This is what he led the LDS Church to do, to discriminate. Black people weren't allowed to be in the church as priests. They weren't allowed to be ordained. They were discriminated against. Salt Lake City. Now, apparently if you teach this, or you say this is critical race theory. But people have to stop saying theory. Theory is something that's not necessarily proven. You can prove what Brigham Young said. You can read his writings. You can go into the archives, the National Archives, and read what the LDS Church believed about black people. So it's not a theory. It's facts that are inconvenient for certain people to have to adjudicate nowadays because they claim they changed. That's why we're doing this whole tour of Salt Lake City, to repair the nation. Folks want to say they change. They say perfect people's out. You haven't realized that this is not applicable anymore. We're all good. We've solved all our problems. And then I ask a simple question. How did you solve the issue? And that's when there's silence. It's crickets. Because nobody can tell me what the restitution was. How the problem was solved. How everybody came to a central agreement that everybody's good nowadays. Utah was so bad. The slavery didn't end in Utah until 1862. The Union soldiers had to build garrisons and forts in Utah to ensure that the Mormon Church wouldn't harm black people after the Civil War. Has the LDS Church paid any restitution for condoning and supporting slavery in America? Well, apparently in June of 2021, last year, not even a year, less than a year ago, the Mormon Church, LDS, and the NAACP, they met and they had a discussion. And the LDS Church said that they're going to pay $9 million over the next 3 years in restitution. You think about that. $9 million over the course of 3 years. So that's $3 million a year. Does anybody think that from the induction and creation of the state of Utah up until 1991, when the LDS Church was still discriminating against Black Americans, does anyone think that $9 million over 3 years is appropriate or fair restitution for the legacy and brutality of what the church did? Then you have on the opposite side the state of Utah, the government. Has Utah as a state paid reparations to any Black citizens in the state? No, they haven't. And maybe that's why you see rampant inequality, where Black residents do live in Salt Lake City. Health disparities, income inequality, educational disparities. Certain individuals want to act like all of those disparities, they're the result of the individuals. It's the individual's fault that they didn't succeed in America. Not decades of discrimination and inhumanity due to racism. No, it's your fault, the individual. Salt Lake City, you can't repair a nation unless you actually want to repair the nation. There's a lot of folks that don't want to repair the nation. They want to talk as though the nation doesn't need any repairing, that there was no damage done, and that this is an over-exaggeration, unnecessary. But you go and you talk to all the people, and the only people to feel that way, that their issue is being completely gaslighted, that they're being completely overlooked, that they're being completely undervalued and underappreciated. All across Utah, all across Salt Lake City, are Black residents and Black citizens, or the African American community. If I'm being too hyperbole about the matter, go and have a town hall with all the residents who happen to be Black in Salt Lake City, and ask them, do you feel as though racism in America has been solved? What's their response going to be? Salt Lake City, Utah. Are they going to say yes? All is right with the world. There has been restitution in America for centuries and decades of atrocities committed against Black people. Is that what they're going to say? Because that's certainly not what we're hearing there seems to be a disconnect between people who are in leadership in Salt Lake City, in Utah, and the black population who live there. You have individuals like Mike Lee, a senator in Utah. Everyone knows Mike Lee is a white nationalist, a white supremacist. And I think nowadays, because there's so many people who are white nationalists and white supremacists, that the term gets desensitized. It doesn't have as much potency. It's like when you say racism exists, or you call out a racist incident. It doesn't have that potency because it happens so much that people become desensitized to it. It's the same with calling out the perpetrators. But you get desensitized to it because when it's built upon a legacy. You know, when you have statues in universities and schools named after racist individuals, white supremacists, what can you expect to still not have? You get what you give. It's no wonder Mike Lee is a senator in Utah. You have Brigham Young University, named after a white supremacist. And make no mistake, Brigham Young is loved by everyone in the Mormon church. Even though every Mormon knows the story of Brigham Young, knows that Brigham Young was a racist. The contradictions. You have to put up mental firewalls to avoid the contradictions in America. And if you don't put up firewalls, then, well, you have to gloss over it. You have to say it's no big deal. Move on. Who does this harm? But those will be the same individuals that, well, if you share anything about these people, you're told that it causes discomfort with their children. I guess having a university named after a racist like Brigham Young and thousands of African Americans attending BYU and learning how great Brigham Young was as an individual, as a visionary and thinker. I guess that causes no discomfort to those youth. You know, people say, especially conservatives, they always talk about pushing an agenda. The left is pushing an agenda for transgender people. The left is pushing an agenda for Black Lives Matter. The left is pushing an agenda. It's the overarching narrative of conservatism. But they're pushing an agenda too. An agenda of intolerance. When When you highlight individuals, Salt Lake City, listen to me good. When you highlight individuals who were clearly intolerant, bigoted, racist, misogynistic, when you highlight those individuals and put them on a pedestal and say that they're prophetic, they're noble, they're great visionary leaders and thinkers, isn't that pushing an agenda too? You're pushing an agenda of white supremacy. Nobody ever accuses conservatives of pushing an agenda to support white supremacy, but that's exactly what they do. They know good and well that Brigham Young was a racist. And John Smith, every other 2 seconds, went back and forth as to whether he wanted to be a racist or didn't want to be a racist. Here, let me stick my finger in the wind and see which way the wind is blowing. That was John Smith. But Brigham Young, there was no question about it. Utah was the only state in the Western Territory that was pro-slavery. That's a fact. That's not a theory. Salt Lake City, it's time to do the right thing. People want to say, well, it was a long time ago. As though something being a long time ago doesn't impact present day. Do people say this about everything though? If you murdered someone 2 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 30 years ago, do people say it was a long time ago that you murdered that individual? It's time to move on. Do people say if you raped an individual 2 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 30 years ago, that it's time to move on? No, there's no statute of limitation on rape and murder. Was there any restitution for all the black people that were lynched and murdered in Utah due to what the LDS Church was espousing about black people? No, there wasn't. And you're telling me in June of 2021, you just now decided to do 9 million? Only after George Floyd, only after Ahmaud Arbery, only after Breonna Taylor, only after Jacob Blake. No, you got busted. You know, everybody wants to say that they're Christian nowadays, especially Americans. You see it all over the cross, and I just laugh. You do know Christian means Christ-like. You gotta ask yourself, how many people did Christ lynch? How many people did Christ say were inferior? I don't recall her saying any of that shit. That was Brigham Young that said that shit. That was John Smith that said that shit. Christ. She never said any of that shit. It's time, Salt Lake City. It's time to pay restitution. People don't want to argue about this. Do they have a better plan to repair the nation? They don't. They don't have a plan to repair the nation. They want to criticize and complain. And yet they offer no ideas. This is the only way to repair the nation. This is not about shame or blaming anybody. This is about doing something that we all knew in 1862, 1865 was necessary. We didn't do it then. We need to do it now. Quite simply, Salt Lake City, it's time to cut the check and cut the bullshit out. This is non-negotiable. I know how negotiations go. They take forever. Then you get an agreement. And people sign on the dotted line. And in America, you get a lunatic after the signature is dried. The date has been inked and printed. You get a lunatic who looks at the paper and puts it in their mouth and eats it. Now the paper doesn't exist anymore. Now there's no treaty. Now there's no agreement. So we're not negotiating. No, there is no negotiation. And there's no, well, I wonder how to do it. Because you've done it before. You can study what other nations have done. Or you can study what other presidents in this nation have done. Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, Honest Abe, he paid the equivalent of $1 million to people who enslaved other people in Baltimore for the loss of property. The only individuals in America who haven't been compensated, granted restitution for the atrocities and inhumanity afflicted upon their ancestors are the African American community. It's atrocious that in 2022 that hasn't occurred. Salt Lake City, it's time to make it happen. Salt Lake City, it's time to repair the nation. This is the only way to repair the nation. You can't build a monument to George Floyd and still have police officers brutalizing black people because you didn't do anything with qualified immunity. You saw what happened when they built the bus for Breonna Taylor in Oakland. People came who were racist and defaced it, shattered it. Racism is still alive and well in America because there's been no accountability, no restitution, no reparations for the damage, for the harm and atrocities that occurred in this nation and still do to this day. Salt Lake City, Utah. Let's get this done.